Hello, everybody. People are just starting to come in. I will give my usual spiel. It's great to see you all. Thank you very much, Andrew, for getting this all organised, and thank you also. I know that Susie and Jess are in the background, off video at the moment. Hello, everybody. Hello. Gosh, great, excellent. Loads of people coming in. Lucy, hello. Alistair, Anna, Anne, Charlie, how are you? I'll say what I always say, which is it would be so much nicer to be doing this in a conference room in a five-star hotel, having just had a nice coffee break and looking forward to a beer. But hopefully, at some point soon, we will do that. So we've got 95 people signed up today. The session is being recorded. So if for any reason you either want to go back over it or you've got to drop off the call for a moment or two, you will be receiving the link to the edited recording tomorrow. So we'll give it a couple more minutes to let a few more people come in. But like I say, we normally anticipate we get about half of the numbers who've signed up. So again, thank you very much, Andrew, for getting this organised. This is the second in a series of corporate housing around the world that Andrew, you've organised for us. So thank you very much indeed for that. I will take myself off screen and hand over to you, Andrew.
Okay, well, thank you and welcome everyone. And I hope you're all kind of settled back into whatever is your five-star. We know it's not hotels for us, but to Tom's point, hopefully that will happen in the not too distant future. So yeah, glad you can all join. Looking forward to an interesting, informative and fun-packed 60 minutes. I mean, the title of this session was Voice of the Customer, but it's going to be kind of much more than that. I hope it's going to be hopefully much more than that. And I think we would probably all agree that the corporate housing ecosystem that we all operate in, potentially is quite complex. I think particularly for a lot of people outside looking in, and that's kind of something that we want to dive into a little bit more. So, as we know, there are solutions providers, operators, landlords, administrators, platforms, databases, booking fees, cancellation policies, and a whole plethora of other terms and processes, situations, etc. that, and those of us that are involved in the industry are fairly used to. But I think what we want to try and do this afternoon with our very esteemed panel is just kind of dig into all of this a little bit deeper, and maybe just also talk a bit more about transparency. What is it that customers might be looking for when they talk about that? So I also want to, hopefully, if we've got some time, and we've got virtually 60 minutes, also ask our panelists to maybe peer into their crystal balls and tell us what do they see is going to be happening with the future. So if we've got time, we'll cover that one off at the end. So with regards to the panel, I'm delighted that we've managed to pry these three folks away from their busy desks for at least 60 minutes, and would like to introduce Gemma Williams to you. And Gemma, for those of you who don't know, she's one of the senior leaders at BGRS and has an awful lot of knowledge and experience in the temporary living space. We also have John O'Connell, who's the Senior Vice President of Global Supply Chain at SIRVA, and I know also not only has got a lot of experience, but also with Gemma is passionate about our industry. And talking about passion in our industry, I don't think we'd be able to say those words without having James Foice join us. So James, as again, many of you may know, is the Chief Executive of the Association of Service Department Providers, and we're delighted that you joined us as well this afternoon, James. So as you can see, we've got two panelists here who are very much speaking from the customer. Not only do they work with many of the Fortune 500 companies, but in terms of their organizations are significant buyers of temporary housing solutions. So hopefully they've got some good kind of insights, and obviously the ear of many customers. And then from James's point of view, whilst I know he has the ear of many probably customers as well, his customers being operators, providers, etc. And again, as James is kind of extremely well known in the industry, has got an awful lot of hopefully knowledge and good words and guidance that he can share with us this afternoon. So I was going to kind of kick off and really maybe ask James if he could perhaps just kind of walk us through this kind of myriad, which I did say is somewhat kind of complex, but just a bit more about the kind of the corporate housing operators and business model. And I know many of us may be kind of familiar with that, but there's also probably plenty of people out there who may not necessarily be just aware of how things kind of knit together. So maybe if we can leave you for a few minutes just to walk us through that, James.
Of course. Thank you very much, Andrew, and for your excellent introduction. You've really positioned me for failure, I think, in terms of what we're trying to do here. Passionate about the industry, certainly am. But I mean, when we were talking about this session and having conversations about what we were, what the aspirations were, we talked a lot about corporate housing. We talked a lot about serviced apartments, apart hotels. So I think one of the challenges we have as an industry, as a sector, is recognition. And the work that we've been doing primarily within the association is to try and create some understanding for the complexities of the serviced apartment, the extended stay, the corporate housing business globally. And I think that that's a really good place to start, because the recognition for what our members do specifically is different in different markets around the world. And I think that's one of the hardest things that we've found, just trying to position the product that so many people actually understand and use and enjoy in different markets around the world, but is understood in different dynamics in different parts of it. So that was really the first hurdle that we had. But our work is very much around differentiating serviced apartments, corporate housing from the organizations that claim to be bona fide operations that actually are out there and offering products that may not provide the same level of safety, duty of care and recognition that, of course, the professional organizations that so many of us know about do. So that's really, I think, one of the biggest challenges we've seen. So when it comes to safety, when it comes to duty of care, when it comes to the objectives of our work, that's very much around the challenges that we see, certainly of late. And of course, I think we must claim, with regard to the sector as it's developing, there is more recognition for it. There has been for such a long time in different markets around the world. So as this grows, as understanding for what we're doing, all of us collectively is growing, I think it's going to make it an easier place and an easier product to recognize, to understand, and of course to book. So, those will be my immediate reactions, Andrew. But it's an interesting environment. I've very firmly been in the hospitality space for much of my professional career, and I think the opportunities that present themselves within a criteria that is growing, most definitely growing, and is becoming more recognized, is really very exciting. So,
and do you see, James, that the different kind of terminology that we appear to use for the same product, dependent on which part of the world we're coming? Do you think that causes misunderstandings? I don't know what you kind of hear from members, where do people must be called this, and is there understanding that the customer will understand what that is? Is it?
Yes, is the simple answer, without question. And I think what's really interesting is that we are seeing our industry is now being recognized by the big global brands. So these are the extended stay products, the big recognizable hotel brands that are now looking to create products that fit very firmly within the residential space, if we want to call it that, the corporate market space. But yes, without doubt, I mean, we've got members in 27 countries around the world, and there is a different understanding, or at least different terminologies in every different marketplace that they operate in. And I'm sure this group will see that as probably one of the biggest challenges. And I think one of the hardest things that we see is the expectations of the client are such that the terminology confuses it. And I think our work is about coming together as an industry, as a sector, as an accommodation medium within this eco structure, if you want to call it that, of accommodation in different markets around the world, and sort of try and agree some kind of clear, common terminology that will meet the expectations of everyone. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and just coming to you, John, you know, as a significant buyer of, and I'm going to call it temporary housing for the moment, services around the globe. How do you see it? Does it appear kind of confusing to you and your teams and customers, the kind of the makeup?
So I think internally our teams have a fairly good handle on it actually, but from a customer perspective, really translating the value proposition can be a challenge. We see just so many nuances in terms of customer priorities and standards and even types of customers. In other words, perhaps the level of employee that a client is moving or things of that nature. There's a very wide gamut of expectations, and I think really clearly aligning, again, the value proposition, what the industry can bring to the table versus a customer going out and trying to source their own accommodation or take care of themselves. I think there's work to do there, and I think there is still some confusion out there at this point.
And Gemma, from your perspective.
Yeah. Sorry, I was also going to agree with John. I think in terms of the different elements that are out there, we're definitely seeing bleed in regards to clients kind of going out to, say, less compliant properties where sort of that safety piece is a concern. But again, I think that is looking at sort of the reason why that is happening and the different types of customers, looking at, maybe towards the graduate end of the policies, and customers who are perhaps used to, booking their own type of accommodation, or perhaps staying in a more hostile environment, not necessarily whack on a backpack and off you go, but more of a kind of controlled element where you do have a shared kitchenette and living space. And I think part of those challenges we're seeing as well is in regards to the budgets that we're seeing for that type of customer. So I think it's kind of moving away possibly from the, I don't want to say kind of standard corporate apartment, but I suppose that is also what I'm saying, towards a more varied elements and having to look beyond the obvious for solutions for varying different types of customer. So I think sometimes when we're talking about the types of accommodation on offer, the compliance and security levels, and the various different names that are associated with those things, definitely leads to, I think, some confusion on the client side, definitely.
And if we're talking about transparency, do you think, because I think sometimes people perceive that to be, is it how I, structure my own internal costs, etc. But to me, it's more about people, sharing more about how the industry works. And I'm just wondering, again, is that something that you hear from customers, or do you see yourself when you're trying to understand, how many layers may there be in, getting, an inquiry to somewhere to then actually physically getting someone into a unit? How many different parties are involved? Is that a challenge?
Yeah, I think layers of cost in the industry is a massive challenge for us. And I think that part of that stems from perhaps a lack of understanding or transparency around what is actually involved behind the scenes. It's not just, I want a 3-day stay in Amsterdam, I go onto a website and I book a property. It's all of the other elements that go beyond it. And I think when you are looking at the use of an administrator model, it is about clarifying the value add that they bring to the process and all of the additional work that goes on behind the scenes, and us being able to kind of really sort of shine a light on all the work that those providers do. But I think the challenge that comes with that is the automatic client assumption that it comes with a huge amount of layers of cost, and trying to kind of scrape down and scrape away those layers. It is definitely a challenge. Even if it is a case of, especially with an administrator model, you have your nightly rate, and then you have your markup on top of that, and it comes to X amount. It's really about trying to talk to clients and educate them about sort of what that is, and really just pull over the veil of confusion over those layers. So it definitely is, I think, probably one of our largest challenges in that area.
What about John? How do you kind of look into this kind of transparency situation?
Yeah, I agree completely with what Gemma shared. It is a challenge when you have the administrator model. I think the awareness in general of the fact that there are often multiple layers, that awareness has grown considerably among clients in recent years. So I do think that's led to, in some cases, some skepticism, some potential concern. So again, echoing what Gemma said in terms of really demonstrating the value proposition. And I do think it's incredibly important in an administrator model for that administrator truly to have tight connections to the market, so you can clearly explain to a client there aren't 3 or 4 or 5 layers here. It's not only about cost. Cost is certainly the biggest and the driving factor, but it's also about how does the need ultimately get translated to the end property and to the provider. And I've personally seen cases where we were working with a major client in a European city where we had some very specific needs expressed, and I met locally with the properties and found that along the layers of supply chain, the needs have been lost. They hadn't even been heard at the local property. So again, I think that demonstrating the value proposition of the model, but also making sure that the model is as tight as possible is very critical.
And James, just coming to you, with regards to your members, and obviously talking with lots of operators and administrators, etc. I mean, is this a subject that gets into conversation at your side, and what do you hear?
Very much. Representing those providers, many of them have come from an environment whereby there were a significant number of non-recognized brands effectively in different markets around the world. So lots of providers offering their solution to the market. How does the market find them? And I think that is one of the biggest challenges that I certainly see from the position that we're looking in on this, that there are an enormous number of providers of service departments in different markets around the world. How do you know, firstly, as a client, if they're up to your expectations, if they provide a product that is safe? And what does safe mean? We could spend the next hour, 45 minutes talking about what safe means, but there's an expectation around safety. How does the client know that? And I think that's really one of the interesting discussions that we see. And of course, the layers we talk about that come in on top of that simplify the process for the client. And I recognize the importance of those various layers and how, well, more than importance, they're absolutely essential in certain transactions in different markets around the world. But certainly what I'm hearing from our members is, how do we break down the complexities of booking a product or reserving a product and make that whole process more transparent and easier? And I think that's probably, if you can answer that for me, Andrew, I think that's probably the question that's been on our industry's forefront for many, many years.
Yeah. So I'm the moderator and not a panelist, being able to answer that one. But yeah, I guess I suppose what I'm kind of taking away there is, there are going to need to be, a certain number of layers anyways, just because, getting the right people doing the right job in different countries means there needs to be, a collective involved. And it may be more is the onus on, operators, administrators, etc., in kind of how we articulate that, to the customer. So I mean, that's kind of just my kind of immediate takeaway. But if we're maybe switching back to John and Gemma here, with regards to your customers, and maybe more from your own requirements, what do you see as kind of the key, or would be your key expectations from a service provider? What would you be expecting with regards to, I don't just mean we have an inquiry, we have a need and we need it to be filled, just in terms of an overall kind of relationship. So, John, are you happy to?
Sure. When we think about the overall relationship, communication, of course, comes up. That's critical. Really understanding, very clear understanding of the provider's capabilities, and also just clear communication on where there could be challenges. I think in general, as RMCs, we're certainly not positioned to be able to have 1,000 local relationships in markets around the world, and we recognize that even in an administrator model, there could be some challenges in fulfilling certain needs, but really just being transparent and communicating around that and working together to find solutions when those things arise. Of course, just also overall expectations of taking great care of the customer is that's critical for us. And what we're finding more and more is there's a real challenge where there's a desire on a lot of customers' parts for sort of standardization in certain areas, yet flexibility in others. So I think from our relationship with our providers, just the ability to flex and adapt to customer needs is also really critical for us as well.
And Gemma, from your perspective, what would you see as the kind of the number one criteria from your customers? If they had a list of 3 or 5 items that are most important, what would be the most important?
I think from the end user, it's being able to have the reliance of walking into a property on every single time, with it being ready for use, and the proper pre-check and inspection precautions have been taken. I think that's especially potently important at this point in time when we have the added complexities of COVID, and the kind of cleanliness concerns that produces. And I think just having that relationship with our providers to enable us to educate the end user in regards to what to expect. Do we need additional timeframes in order to turn properties around? Are we going to expect less cleaning on a weekly basis? What happens if an electrical appliance like a washing machine breaks down? The traditional routes towards fixing that issue in a really nice and timely manner has gone away. We can't just give them laundrette tokens to use because the laundrettes aren't working. I think it's just about ensuring that we can work proactively together to rely on those providers getting that job done first and foremost, and then obviously working with us very closely and quickly to resolve any issues that come up. And then I think from a supply chain point of view, it kind of goes back to what John was saying. I think there is a wealth of information that providers have at their fingertips in regards to historic rates, year-on-year fluctuations, market information. I think it's about ensuring that we have a partner who educates us and talks to us about, changes, whether that's rates or markets. So in turn, we can proactively go to our clients and talk to them about their volume, their markets, their experience, so that we can start to kind of build up that picture together with those clients to be able to better set expectations, I think, in some of the challenges that are likely to come ahead. I mean, we're hearing sort of various different things, possibly in relation to COVID, for example, the drop in occupancy levels. Is that going to lead to a price hike? How can we work with our providers to preempt that, or to work on solutions together that could offer, not necessarily a saving, but a different way of looking at rates? So it's kind of that customer focus, that customer experience, versus, I think, the kind of the supply chain side of things, and ensuring that we have a robust working relationship with our suppliers so we can work together on various different solutions and the complex challenges that often come with many of our corporate clients.
Thank you. And just turning to you, James, do you kind of hear from members, any particular challenges they may have, in working with the corporate clients? Is there anything that kind of stands out?
I think what's been really interesting over these last, 12, 13 months is the expectations on those that are traveling and using apartment accommodation at the moment. And I think initially we didn't know very much about COVID and what it meant, and we assumed that apartments needed to be vacant between stays for 3 days. So this whole process has educated us all in understanding actually how the guest can be as safe as they possibly want. And what we're encouraging all of our members is to be as flexible as they possibly can be and provide those assurances that Gemma was talking about in terms of managing the expectations. I think everyone, when they arrive, should expect the apartment to be, let's use the term sanitized. It should be a safe place to come into, and I don't think anyone can challenge that. But what we've seen is many number of different ways of doing that. And I think the communications that our members and our providers are offering the client is really quite significant, and that's down to the chemicals being used, the technology being used to ensure that environment is sanitized, you know, and any number of different permutations, because you've only got control over an area that you've actually got control over, if you know what I mean. So public spaces, arrival points, communal areas you have less control over, and that's perfectly okay if the client understands the risks associated with it and they can make the necessary changes. So we've seen it's all about communication, and that's the arrival points, which are relatively easy to manage in terms of a process. The challenge comes when there's cleaning protocols required, or as Gemma was suggesting, maintenance issues that might need to be tackled. And I think, you know, what we're seeing is that communication extending into the entire point of stay, whereby guests are communicated with through the technology and through the various means that they have at the moment. Cleaning protocols may be extended, and many of our members are providing cleaning packs to guests that are staying within apartments at the moment. And I think, you know, that gives the guests the opportunity to clean if they felt that they needed to in the environment in which they're staying, whereby that environment only contains them effectively. So the potential for transmission is significantly less. So that's how we've seen things develop within our side. But I think, you know, I keep going back to the point that there is so many different variations and solutions out there. It must be incredibly difficult for everyone to understand what is a legitimate process and what isn't. And I think, you know, that's really the opportunity we as an industry have to try and get some consistency going.
No, I completely agree. And I think also, hasn't it, with, you know, different countries have been taking, you know, different routes with regards to, you know, how they manage travellers coming into the country, out of the country, and then when they're there, you know, local rules, regulations. So it's kind of a difficult one for, you know, everyone to kind of keep up to speed with regards to that. But I mean, as far as the pandemic, I mean, it's obviously had a you know, a significant impact on the industry. And I mean, how do you see, you know, the resiliency of, you know, the marketplace currently? You know, given there's been, you know, people who've found and decided that it's no longer for them. Others just, you know, have been consumed by the tide, so to speak. So.
From a provider's perspective, I think it's fascinating, and there has naturally been some casualties, as there has in any element of business that we're experiencing at the moment. But there's also been quite a significant amount of consolidation within the providers' worlds as well, which I think is probably a good thing, because it makes it less diluted, and it actually makes the consistency around the brand recognition a lot more easier to understand, and of course processes and everything else that comes with that. But you know, we've seen certainly from our membership, some operators have, as you rightly suggest, have gone out of business, and they would have done through a commercial environment that we're all faced with. But I think what has been fascinating about our industry is that it's continued over the last 12 months. Whereas, you know, conventional styles of accommodation possibly have struggled because they've had to shut, whereas our industry has continued, much of which has been operating at between sort of 55 and 65% occupancy. So I think that bodes incredibly well for a sector that hopefully can exit this period in a reasonably strong position. You'll know me, I'll always be very positive about any opportunity that we're facing, and I think we should be. I think that we are seeing that there are organizations that are not looking next week, not looking ahead to the month after, they're actually looking ahead to the year ahead from now, whereby they're looking at investment. So we're optimistic that as we exit this period, that our sector is going to be in a really strong position to service the needs of traveling clients.
And John, just coming to you, I mean, is it something that kind of keeps you up at night? You know, having seen, you know, some of the things that have happened with, you know, regards to, you know, people no longer being in the industry, and obviously the pressures on, you know, occupancy rates, etc., etc. What's your kind of take on things?
So certainly, there have been some what I would describe more as short-term concerns, I guess I'd say. And by that I'm not referring to people who have had to exit the market. Of course, that's terrible, and that has happened, and then of course some of that has occurred. But things like what we've seen in the short term is we've had guests in accommodation that had to be moved sort of mid-stay because of something that had happened with a provider. That type of thing will always keep me up at night when a guest experience is being directly interrupted like that. But when I look at the longer term, for the providers who are faring and lasting through this, I see this area as really having some good potential for recovery in the longer term. You know, if we look at it, this is one of the primary needs our clients always have. The need for corporate housing, I don't think is going to go away in a traditional relocation. I think there are new avenues that are coming into play as well. We've spoken to certain clients that are allowing employees, you know, we've all gone more to remote work and different environments. We've spoken with customers who are willing to say, well, you know, I'll let my employee go work from Paris for a month or go work for London for a month. So I think there could be some new needs emerging out of that. I've also been really impressed with the way some of our providers have essentially pivoted during this really challenging time. So we've seen providers that had a high amount of inventory that began just leasing out their units as just furnished units for 1 year, recognizing it's going to be a while before inventory recovers, or before demand recovers, I should say. Just get at least a portion of the inventory rented just to be able to sustain in the meantime. We've seen cases where units have been marketed as a place to go if you're not really able to work from home. So if you're a family that has a very, you know, an environment at home where perhaps small children or pets or other things where it's very difficult to work, we've seen providers say, you know, rent a unit for a discounted rate and you can go work from there during the day. So those types of solutions and the creativity that I've seen coming into play, I think has been really impressive. And again, although I don't underestimate what's happening right now at all, it's you know, unfortunate, of course, to see some of what has occurred. I do think that the long-term potential is there.
It is interesting, isn't it? And you know, in troubled times, just how, you know, innovative and creative people can be, and you know, that kind of entrepreneurship kind of comes to the surface. You know, where perhaps people didn't realise it was set. And Gemma, from your side, you know, what's kind of the BGRS's you know, perspective of you know, the state of the industry?
Yeah.
By the way, I know, but to put it quite like that.
No, I mean, I think I agree with John in terms of, I think it's driving innovation and different ways of looking at things. I think it's certainly interesting, as James says, in terms of how our industry has, you know, kept going. It's not sort of fixed on that leisure traveller, which I think has possibly been the forefront of a lot of kind of focus for some providers over the last few years. And I think, you know, when it does come to that innovative approach of finding different solutions for things, I think, again, that is a differentiator in the market in comparison to some of the sort of simple online kind of platforms where you do have those relationships with those providers, and you can look to share in that different way of thinking and use that to kind of drive innovation and change, I think, you know, some relationships. So I think it will definitely be interesting to see how things progress. I don't think anybody is sort of quite, you know, out of the woods just yet. I mean, we've got lots of clients who, who've got various different relocation packages in terms of, on hold. Some are continuing, some are kind of driving. We're looking at possibly stays, I think, in less traditional areas. I think, as people possibly move away from city centres, like John said, maybe they do want to go and stay in an apartment somewhere for a month instead of keep going back and forth and travelling, which is good for business. But is that going to be more suburban stays as opposed to city centre stays? And I think let's not forget that sort of once everything does really restart to open, I think we're all more or less dying to get on a plane and go somewhere and see things and see people, whether that's sort of for tourism or for business. So I think, it'll be one to watch. I mean, I think this time last, or sort of 6 months ago, we've kind of talked a lot internally about, are we going to expect a big boom in volume, almost like, you sort of open the floodgates and it's all going to come back, and I don't necessarily think that's going to be the case either. And again, we're having to deal with borders globally who continuously flex and change in terms of restrictions, travel corridors that open, close, and I do think actually it's probably fairly healthy. I think one of the largest spends for our client is on the temp living sphere, as guests have to quarantine longer, or it takes them longer to find a property because they're having to deal with the local restrictions, and things are taking longer for the household goods to arrive. So I think from that aspect, it probably has actually worked quite well for our providers this year, albeit generally things are down. So I think it's positive. It's just getting to that point when we start to see things pick up again, I think, is the key.
Okay. So there hasn't been kind of a lot of nervousness from your clients kind of knocking on the door saying, is this a route that we should still be considering? They're still, and I know you're kind of managing this for them in 150 countries or what have you, but
I think there's the general nervousness. I think when there are large changes in a market, acquisitions, mergers, or people going out of business, our corporates are aware as to what's going on. But I think they trust that there are options out there and things will continue. And I think that's kind of what it is. It's just that close partnership, ensuring that we are, as an industry, sharing information and talking to each other, all the way through that chain, so that we can work together to ensure that solutions are robust and there is an industry to kind of encourage back into working.
Good. No, thank you. And I'm going to kind of stay with you, if I may, Gemma, because I know, if we start to kind of maybe look at some trends, and one of the things that I know, when we spoke briefly the other day, you were talking about how sustainability, and I know I'll come to you, John, with regards to diversity, that you're seeing kind of more of an interest from your customers around that, and I don't know whether you could just just to share a little bit about kind of where you and BGRS see that and its importance.
Yeah, definitely. So I think COVID is the word of 2020 and so far this year. But I think arguably there is a more long-lasting, profound kind of impact, which is, as you say, sustainability, more specifically climate change. I think there are a number of drivers relating to this, including regulation, investor interest, public pressure, have all put sustainability at the top of the board agenda, especially for our European headquartered clients. I think especially in Europe, I think more than 40 countries have mandatory greenhouse gas reporting schemes in place. It's a project that a lot of our corporate clients are also very passionate about, and they're looking at their supply chains, which includes BGRS, to report on sustainable efforts. And I do think as an industry, we need to think about how that's going to be reflected. How can we report on initiatives in a quantifiable way that can contribute both to BGRS's own commitments as well as our corporate clients? And I think, given the economic status, it can be a challenging area. Sometimes, upgrades and especially environmental ones can come with a cost. So it's a delicate area, I think, for us to consider. But we can also look at smaller changes. For example, how can we measure the impact of reducing bedding and linen washing? Can we look at energy efficient LED lighting that is motion detected? What about electric charge points or utilizing electric vehicles for deliveries? Who out there has the ISO 14,000, for example? Who is a green supplier? What is a green supplier? I think we just need to have some more conscious thinking and conversations to lead to a better partnership. We kind of need to understand what are people doing in the sustainability sphere, and how can we, thus report that to our clients in terms of quantifiable data. So I think, looking at what people are doing already is fantastic, but how we can report that back, I think is another element and another challenge that I think is going to be at the forefront of 2021 and beyond for us especially.
And do you think that means that in time there may, we might almost get to a place where there is, a kind of a minimum expected standard? There'll be certain criteria. I mean, there are for a number of things already, but things that, kind of comfortably sit under that kind of sustainability umbrella, do you think?
I think so for certain clients, absolutely. I mean, every client has differing kind of focus, but I think for some, absolutely, we're kind of already seeing some look to predetermine Wi-Fi speeds. So whilst that's not necessarily sustainability, I do think we're going to start to see that come through. I've had a client, for example, put forward the use of environmentally friendly coat hangers. So I think that type of small elements is going to start to creep in. They're going to want to understand, who in the network is kind of green, who has accreditations, who is doing what. So I do believe that over the course of the next few years, we're absolutely going to start to see clients dictating what they will and will not accept in regards to sustainability. Yeah.
Okay. More to come for sure.
Yeah.
And just switching over to you, John, and I know when we also spoke the other day, we kind of touched on, how diversity is obviously always been, critically important, but I think it was kind of having more focus in some of the, requirements that, customers you're seeing, I think particularly in the Americas. So are you happy to share a little bit more about that with us?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting just tying back to the sustainability point for a moment, because we are hearing more about sustainability from our European clients and from Australian clients as well, actually. It's not that we're not hearing about sustainability in North America, but it's not as prevalent yet. I have a feeling it'll be coming soon. So it's certainly an important area of focus. Within North America, I think largely due to events that have happened, diversity has become very much front and center over the last 12 months, and it's really perceived as a critical element. We have had an unprecedented number of inquiries about our diversity spend, specifically how much are we by sector, by area, how much are we spending with diverse suppliers. And it's interesting, similar to what Gemma was describing on the sustainability point. Within diversity, there aren't necessarily standard classifications that work on a global basis. So certain countries have their own standards, and it's a small number of countries at this point. So I think there is a good deal of work to be done to really think about what can truly apply globally, and how can you measure diversity globally when you're looking at where you are directing your spend. But it's a very important area of focus, and I think along with sustainability, it's just going to continue to grow. So I think, you know, both of these areas are going to be things we'll be talking about more and more in the years ahead.
And just jumping to you, James, I mean, are you kind of hearing things from your members about this, or are they, you know, asking for, you know, further details? What does it mean? What should they be doing? Or many, I guess, may already be, you know, compliant, for want of a better word.
What's fascinating, just hearing everyone talk about this, is of course representing providers. Providers have for some time been looking for efficiencies in how they operate. And I start with that point really carefully, because energy saving devices tend to be cheaper to operate. And the driver from a provider's perspective has been around exactly that. Let's put energy saving light bulbs in, for an example, or let's use product that lasts longer than single use stuff, if you're with me. So it's been happening. And I think where we are now is a bit of a transition into a realization that decisions are being awarded on the back of certain criteria that may or may not be in place. And one of those is sustainability. And we're seeing that from a deliverer's perspective. And I think also to support that, we for some years, as you know, have been running awards programs within our association. And 5 years ago, we introduced a sustainability award. And I think we may have had 1 or 2 entries. And year on year on year, that has grown. So what we have here is an ecosystem of a complement. But what we're not doing as an industry is promoting that properly in a marketable package, but a way in which communicating that to the world. And I think we are now at that point. We've seen a number of surveys, and we've had some within our association, whereby those deciding factors have now come from 6 or 7 down the list up to number 3 of the decision-making protocols that might be in place. So the stars are aligning, and certainly from a sustainability perspective, which I think everyone that we talk to is in favor of supporting. I think diversity is really interesting, isn't it? And John's point about recognition for that in different markets around the world, I think that's fascinating as well. But I think it's all part of this ecosystem that we're seeing a lot of complement towards anyway.
Are you seeing any, you know, particular trends in, you know, in any of the markets that, you know, members are in? I mean, are you finding you're getting, you know, more questions, or you're hearing more, you know, in some parts of Europe, for example, as opposed to, you know, Middle East, as an example?
A difficult question to answer given the challenges that we've had recently. I'm having a lot of individuals, you know, let's talk about London. Just a year and a half ago, everybody who was operating apartments wanted to be in the square mile of London. And of course, these big city centre locations now, whether it be London, whether it be Paris, whether anywhere in Europe, certainly are in many ways ghost towns. So I think Gemma made the point that maybe movement into the suburbs for longer stays is what's going to be more desirable, assuming the communications are right. And I think if there was a trend, I've probably had more organizations echo that sentiment, whereby extended stay products, apartment products can be used for both longer term stays and office environments and whatever else we might want to use them for. And I think having those in a location whereby they're not smack bang in the city centres is something we've certainly seen. And peripheral cities as well, those that aren't satellite cities, for example, that aren't quite so popular as they used to be. So I think that what we're experiencing is a complete transition in how we're going to see our industry, certainly the markets in which they're going to be operating. And I think everyone's open to providing, and that's the beauty of the apartment industry, is it can flex incredibly quickly because it's still very entrepreneurial, and it can relocate and flex and do what it needs to move around to satisfy its needs. So.
And we look forward to that, because we know that that's how we're all going to need to be nimble. So I'm just going to come back to you, John, and I mean, we're not planning on talking, you know, in detail about technology within the industry, because I'm sure we could run a whole session literally just on that. But in terms of if you had a wish list and there were some things that you would like your providers to be able to do, what would be on that wish list from a tech point of view?
So I guess the first point I'd touch on is actually something that I think has arisen, back to the earlier points about duty of care and COVID, with touchless check-in being more common, just use of video technology, sending something out to a customer to say, here's what's going to happen when you arrive, walk them through the process and show them how to check in without actually interacting with anybody. Great way to directly impact the customer experience and make them feel very comfortable when they're arriving at the facility, and they'll know what's happening. Beyond that, we certainly hear broader questions or needs really based on just overall, I think, changes in how customers are used to interacting with technology. So for that, for example, what I mean is expectations around things like instant booking, which I know is incredibly challenging, but clients are seeking it and want to be able to have that. Things like self-booking by employees, to just literally click the button and be able to handle it themselves without necessarily having the RMC involved or back and forth. Those types of things are certainly emerging as requirements. And again, I know they're not at all easy to solve, but if we were looking at a wish list, they would certainly be on it. One final point that I'd add, and this is one I think that many of us in the RMC space are focused on, is just really strong integration with the providers, so that via APIs or other forms, data can flow smoothly and seamlessly through our own platforms out to customers. We're just in an age where people don't want to wait for information. So I think the more integrated we can become, that's only going to enhance the ultimate solution for the customer.
Great, and thank you. And Gemma?
Yeah, I think similar to John, really, in terms of fully sort of integrated piece is going to be, I think, critical. I think, again, making technology as user-friendly as possible. I think John made some really great points there in terms of the use of video technology. I think app-based technology is really important, so that you have access to your booking information on your mobile phone. You have live availability mapped, possible map tracker from your apartment to your office or to the airport, timeline countdown to your extension request or departure deadline, through your app, possible connectivity to local information points. I think especially during COVID, where can I go and order my groceries online in this brand new location where I can't go out, I don't want to go out, I don't know anyone, I don't speak the local language. I think having those kind of customer elements at the forefront is really important. And I think another kind of point in terms of technology is really enhanced reporting. I think as a kind of group, there is so much information available at your fingertips. Like I was saying earlier, in terms of historic rates, how can we utilize your knowledge, your data to better educate our clients and set those expectations? So I think kind of enhancing that customer usability as well as reporting, I think, are kind of my two big things. Easy.
It was, but anyway, I think the desire is there, isn't it? It's just having the resources and dollars, amongst other things. And James, from your point of view, given the state of how operators are kind of feeling at the moment, given the level of bookings, given occupancy rates. But I think you'd also already touched on that. There is, some brilliant organisations out there who are kind of seeing, what we've been through and are still going through as an opportunity. But obviously, finding, revenue to, invest in technology can be a stretch. But I just wondered whether you're kind of hearing anything. Is there, what members are planning or talking about, or or anything that you're kind of promoting from, you know, an industry perspective?
It's really nice to hear those wish lists that both Gemma and John were talking about, because I'm hearing that from the industry, if you like, from the providers saying, how do we do this? How do we create real-time availability effectively? How do we make sure our products can be listed in real time? How do we I don't know, how do we enhance technological products to improve the guest experience? So it's coming, is what I would be saying. Our industry has to, and it will do. And there's a lot of solutions we've all talked about over the last few years around OTA equivalence and around real-time availability. And many of our operators are working in an environment where agents and aggregators are providing that level of interface. So I think it's definitely coming. I think things like touchless entry products have been around for a while. Whether it's not necessarily technologically driven, it could be other ways of doing it. I think that's an important part. But just seeing the entrepreneurial spirit that the industry is presenting itself, I think it's just fascinating. How can our industry better adapt its product to meet the needs of the customer? And it will continue to be open to have these conversations. It's certainly not a closed shop. I mean, I think everyone will understand that any efficiency that can be identified and can be understood will certainly be investigated. That's what I'm hearing anyway. And there's the desire, Andrew, there's the desire to want to make it happen.
I think that kind of comes through loud and clear. So, and I'm conscious of the time, so I'm just going to ask one of my colleagues who I think has been hopefully keeping sight of any questions. So we'll just give Susie.
Yes.
Susie, over to you.
Yes. Can you explain the administrative model? What other models are there?
Well,
I can probably take that one, at least from my position. It is essentially a kind of large temp living provider who has access to thousands often of additional local providers. And as an RMC, we utilize an administrator model because we simply don't have the capabilities of managing that type of supply chain on our own. So having these kind of large, often global corporations as our key suppliers, it then sort of helps to have that sub-supplier network and access to all of the many different varieties of more local providers. So that's kind of what I mean by that.
It's a good answer, thank you. I was going to jump in myself, but thinking, no, it's not my job here. So, thank you.
Okay. And there's one more question. Would there be a benefit in looking regionally as opposed to global providers for temporary living? In our market, we provide information to agencies who are then providing this information to RMCs and then to the client. So this is a fair amount of layering to the client. So are there benefits to looking regionally? And there's also other benefits to looking at global suppliers.
Yeah, I think a regional supplier is going to offer as much inventory and value to us as a global supplier. I think often it depends on your buying strategy. You know, we would not typically look to source a single global provider. We have in the past looked to regional administrators for those needs. But I think it's just about having choice and what best fits that business. And again, I think it's also just about ensuring that you understand your client needs. And I think, you know, we are seeing lots of clients who have established relationships with local providers, which is completely understandable. We do want to support that, but we also need to be mindful of our own staffing capabilities and just ensuring that we have a business model that best fits BGRS as well as our clients. So we're certainly not adverse to looking at things from a regional level. It kind of just depends on various different factors. But yes.
I would agree with that from a SIRVA perspective. We're not locked in that it has to be a global provider. It ultimately comes down to overall capabilities. And if somebody stands out extremely strong in a region, certainly that makes sense to look at. In contrast, if you've got a global provider who covers all the regions extremely well, that can make a lot of sense. I agree exactly with what Gemma said. We certainly get a number of clients who want to work with, very local providers, and often in that administrator model, there are cases where we'll work directly with them, or we could be going through the regional or global provider to do that. So, I think it's always important to be open to options, to look at what makes the most sense, and not to assume that anything's set in stone.
Great answers, thank you. Any more, Susie?
Yep, can we squeeze in one more? This is a great one to end on. What can we as suppliers / service apartment providers do to help better educate your clients, especially in terms of allocation? For example, showing them the advantages of a property that is situated outside the city center. So what can we do to help better educate your clients?
You want to jump on that one first, John?
Well, thank you, Andrew. Tough question. I'm struggling to come up with a consistent answer, because the client needs can vary so differently in terms of what they're looking for and what they're expecting. We've seen clients that have just an incredibly long list of very specific requirements, and they're fixed on them, and there isn't a willingness necessary to budge. I think, I guess what I'd say is, the key thing that comes to mind would be, under any circumstances, I suppose, really being prepared to help the client understand the overall local market and understand the factors in play, whether it be inventory availability, whether the very specific requirements that the client is expressing is truly available in the market, but just being available as a resource to provide that local information, particularly in centers where a client has a high amount of activity.
And I think, sort of to add to that as well, I think a lot of it is down to the client itself, and it's not necessarily the requirements of the guest, but I think sometimes the internal workings of the client. So, for example, when it comes to budget pressures, they're not necessarily pressures that have been brought on by the Global Mobility team. It might be local HR teams who think they can get a better deal versus their Global Mobility. So I think it's kind of that smoke and mirrors elements that often comes behind some of the guest requirements that also need to factor into the decisions, and they're not necessarily pieces of information, I guess, that would work their way down to the supply chain, but I think that comes into play in addition to looking at it from a client requirement specific point of view. So not one easy answer. I totally agree with John there.
No, thanks for that, Gemma. So I'm literally just going to come to you all with one kind of quick, well, it hopefully will be a quick answer from you. And that's just with regards to kind of looking forward the rest of 2021 and into 2022. If you were gazing in that crystal ball, what do you see? So, Gemma.
Ooh, if I knew the answer to that, I'd play the lottery. I think it's going to be tough. I think there's going to be client pressures on spending and cost. I think equally there's probably going to be a desire for providers to try and offset some of the occupancy levels of this year. I'm not saying there's a pricing war, but I think there are going to be some challenging conversations around that in future. I also think there's probably going to be challenges around service levels. I think as we move out of COVID, people are going to be less forgiving in regards to making changes and accepting differences in terms of what they're used to getting. But I think generally overall it's kind of looking positive from my perspective. Volume will come back, travel will happen again. I think it's just a case of possibly sitting tight for a little bit longer and seeing what happens.
John?
Yeah, I guess I'd go back to a comment Gemma made earlier, which I would agree with, which is I don't think we're going to see a sudden flood of volume. I know we all wish that were the case, and I think we all wish we were jumping on planes tomorrow ourselves. But I too remain optimistic. I think we are going to see continued improvement. I think, I think it's likely to come more in the latter half of the year, but I do think there'll be steady improvement. I do think client expectations are going to be very high in terms of just clear communication and understanding what's going on in the market. Is it the right time to send people in? And certainly we'll all be under pressure to make sure that there's availability of inventory, and we're doing our best to control costs, even in what might be somewhat of a state of reduced inventory. So it's, I think we've got a good deal of work ahead in the months ahead. But again, I remain pretty optimistic about what this looks like in the longer term.
Good, great, thank you. And James, and I know you're always, optimistic and enthusiastic, but would still value your opinion.
I remain, Andrew, optimistic and enthusiastic, because if anyone feels as I do, desperate to get out and meet somebody and to have that glass of beer, Dominic, you and I were talking about earlier, but just to have a meeting with somebody, and even if a proportion of that helps kickstart travel, we're going to be in a better place than we are now.
Yeah, to all of that. And I know we've run over, but I want to thank all of you genuinely for giving up your time. I hope everybody out there has found this really useful, interesting. Euro will be, or have recorded this, and when they paid us all of the appropriate fees, we'll allow them to then circulate it. And also just to let everybody know that Euro will be hosting a virtual conference in May. More details to come on their website, so please do kind of keep an eye out for that. But thank you, Gemma, John and James. It's always fun to sit and talk with you, so thank you very much.
And Andrew, thank you for putting this together. Thank you, Gemma. Thanks, John. Thanks, James. That was a really interesting session. I'm sorry we didn't get to the comments that came through in the chat box, but time has run away with us. But thank you. There's really nice messages coming in, thanking you all for a really, really innovating and positive session. That was great. So yeah, thank you very much indeed. Andrew's correct. We are doing another virtual event in May. We were hoping we would be doing an in-person one, but not to be. But I agree with you, James. As soon as we can, we certainly will. Thank you so much, everybody. You take care, and the recording will be edited tomorrow. Thanks again, everybody. Thanks again, Andrew.
Yeah, all the best, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Bye.
Stay safe.